The ground shook like thunder under their feet. Rocks rained down from above, blocking the only exit behind them. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Lights flickered and died, leaving everything in a dim red glow. Jake, a human engineer from Earth, looked around in shock. He had been guiding an alien inspection team through the old tunnels. They were checking the ancient cave system once used for mining energy crystals. But now, only he and one alien girl remained inside. The others were gone. Thyra, the alien girl with silver blue skin and bright violet eyes, stood calmly. She didn't panic. Even as huge stone blocks trapped them inside, Jake ran to the fallen rocks and tried to move one. It didn't even budge. "Are you okay?" he asked, coughing from the dust. Thyra nodded, but she was holding her leg. Blood, dark and glowing faintly, dripped down from under her uniform. Jake's eyes widened. "You're hurt," he said. Dropping to his knees beside her, Thyra sat down against the cold wall and looked at her leg. A sharp crystal spike had pierced through her lower leg and pinned her to the ground. She tried to pull it out but winced in pain. Jake activated his wrist computer and checked the map. "No signal. No connection," he muttered. "We're too deep underground." He turned to her. "We have to get you out of here somehow." Thyra looked at him, her voice calm. "You won't be able to move this stone," she said. "We're trapped, unless we find another way." Jake paced back and forth, his mind racing. He remembered passing a junction earlier. A broken elevator shaft. Maybe if they reached it, they could climb up and send a signal. But Thyra couldn't walk, not like this. She looked at him and said something strange. "You'll have to cut off my leg." Jake froze. "What did you say?" "You'll have to cut it off," she repeated softly. He stared at her completely shocked. "Are you serious?" he asked. Thyra nodded. "It's the only way." "No way," Jake said, shaking his head. "I'm not doing that." "You must," she said. "My body will grow it back, but only if the damage is removed." Jake blinked. "You can regrow limbs?" Thyra nodded again. "It is part of my species, from our warrior evolution." Jake looked at her injured leg again, the crystal pinning her down. There was no way to lift it without causing more damage. Time was running out, oxygen was limited, and no rescue signal was being sent. "But it'll hurt," Jake said, almost to himself. "Yes," she whispered. "It will hurt a lot." He stood up and opened his tool pack. Most of his tools were made from machines, not flesh and bone, but he found a sharp plasma cutter. Small but powerful. He looked at her again, unsure. "Only if you're sure," he said, voice low. "I am," she replied. "Do it quickly." Jake moved beside her and activated the plasma blade. The blue light flickered, and heat radiated from the tool. Thyra bit down on a piece of cloth, her hands gripping the cold floor. He aimed carefully and began. The sound of sizzling filled the tunnel. Thyra screamed through her teeth, but she didn't move. Jake's hands shook, but he kept going. After a minute that felt like an hour, it was done. The leg was off, and blood pooled on the floor. Jake wrapped the wound quickly with bandages and sealed it with heat gel. Her body was already starting to react, small cells glowing at the edge of the stump. Jake sat back, breathing hard. "I did it," he whispered. But before either of them could relax, they heard a sound. A low growl echoed through the tunnel. Behind them, Jake turned, eyes wide. That was not a machine, and it was not friendly. Thyra's eyes opened wide too. "There's something else down here," she whispered. Jake grabbed a torch and slowly stood up. The shadows moved as the growl came closer. Whatever it was, it had woken up, and now it was hunting. Jake held his breath as the low growl echoed again through the stone tunnel. The sound was not like any creature he had heard before. It was wet, deep, and angry, like something old and hungry had just woken up. He glanced down at Thyra, her face pale from pain but her jaw tight with focus. She tried to sit up, but her balance was gone. Her one leg twitched slightly, and the end of the stump glowed faintly. Little threads of glowing tissue began reaching outward, like small vines. Searching for shape, Jake couldn't believe what he was seeing. Her leg, the one he had just cut off, was already starting to grow back. He had heard of alien biology before, but this was far beyond anything humans had studied. He grabbed her hand and helped her sit up straight. The growling stopped for a moment, followed by slow dragging sounds on the stone floor. It was getting closer, and it wasn't in a hurry. Thyra took a sharp breath, her voice low but steady. "We must move now." "You can't walk," Jake said quickly. "You're still bleeding." "I'll manage," she replied, reaching for a thick pipe nearby to use as a crutch. Jake stood and turned his wrist light toward the dark path ahead. The tunnel split in two directions, but one was caved in. They had no choice. Only one path was open, and it led deeper into the old mine. As they moved, Thyra limped beside him, breathing through the pain. Jake looked at her with new eyes now, not just as an aniso alien, but as something far stronger. She had stayed calm, let him cut off her leg, and was still pushing forward. He didn't know if he would have had that kind of courage. Thyra spoke again, her voice a little softer. "You are not trained for pain." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Thanks, I guess." She almost smiled, but then winced and gripped her makeshift crutch tighter. "I was grown to handle it," she said. "My people used to fight with blades and teeth. We were modified long ago to survive even the worst wounds." Jake was silent for a moment, then said, "But why would you still keep that?" "I thought your people moved beyond war." Thyra looked ahead, her eyes cold for a moment. "Not all of us did." The tunnel opened into a wider space with broken metal walls and shattered glass. It looked like part of an old underground station, maybe even a lab. There were marks on the walls, long scratches, as if something had been trapped here before. Jake kept his torch moving, his heart pounding in his chest. Something about this place felt wrong. Too quiet, too old. But Thyra pointed to the far end, where a narrow passage blinked with a faint blue glow. "That light," she whispered. "It may come from a power source." Jake nodded and helped her across the cracked floor. Behind them, the dragging sound returned, louder now, closer. Jake turned and saw nothing, but he knew something was watching. Inside the passage, they found a small room with a round console. Built into the wall, old alien text glowed on the display, and power lines hummed gently. Jake opened his kit and connected his translator. It flickered, buzzed, then gave a weak signal. "Emergency beacon, damaged energy source low." He let out a breath. "If we can boost the power, we might send a signal." Thyra leaned against the wall, her breathing slow but steady. Her stump had grown more, almost to her knee now, the new limb glowing softly. Jake looked at her again. "Does it hurt?" "More than anything," she whispered. "But I have lived through worse." He didn't ask what worse meant. He returned to the console and began checking the connections. Thyra sat still, listening carefully, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Then she whispered sharply, "Jake." He looked up. "I smell it," she said. "It's here." Jake grabbed a wrench and stepped in front of her. The torch flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. A shape moved across the doorway, tall and thin, its limbs bending wrong. Jake raised the wrench, his hands shaking. The creature hissed softly, like it was testing their fear. But it didn't enter, not yet. Thyra placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "We need to make it fear us instead," she said. Jake looked at her, confused. "How do we do that?" She smiled through the pain. "By acting like humans." Jake didn't understand what she meant at first. Act like humans? He wanted to ask more, but the thing in the shadows made a strange clicking sound. It was standing just outside the light, moving slowly, step by step. Its limbs were long and thin, its body hunched low like it was made for crawling. Its eyes reflected the light like wet stones, unblinking, cold, and silent. Thyra's fingers tightened on his shoulder. "Humans are loud, stubborn, and fearless," she whispered. They bite even when cornered. Jake looked down at the wrench in his hand. It didn't feel like much, not against something like that. But something about her words sparked something inside him. Not courage exactly, but anger. He stepped forward and slammed the wrench against the metal wall. The sound rang through the room like thunder. The creature froze, head tilted. Jake shouted, voice full of defiance, "Yeah, that's right. Come on, you ugly thing. I'm right here." Thera joined in, lifting a broken metal pipe and banging it on the floor. The noise echoed again and again, like drums before battle. For a moment, the creature hesitated. Then, without warning, it backed away into the dark. Gone for now, Jake exhaled slowly, sweat running down his face. Thera gave a small nod, her voice soft. Fear is universal, even in monsters. Jake looked at her stump again, which had now reached almost halfway to her foot. He knelt beside her and adjusted the bandages, trying to keep the new tissue clean. "Do you feel okay?" "It burns," she said, "like fire inside my bones. But it's working," he said. "You're healing." The console behind them buzzed again, then sparked. Jake rushed back to it, tapped a few buttons, and frowned. Still not enough. "Power," he muttered. He opened a hidden panel and found old cables. Wires melted, circuits dusty and dead. They needed something strong, something alive. Thera pointed toward a narrow hallway leading deeper into the cave network. There was a reactor room in the ancient plans, she said. It may still hold energy. Jake looked at her, surprised. "You memorized the plans?" "I don't forget things," she said simply. Jake helped her stand, and together they limped toward the hallway. The path narrowed, walls growing tighter, and the air colder. Small bones littered the floor, old remains of creatures that had never escaped. Jake tried not to look too closely at the skulls. They moved slowly, the only sound their footsteps and Thera's soft breaths. Her leg was still growing, now just missing a foot. She could almost walk without the pipe now, but her face showed pain with every step. As they turned a corner, a sudden noise made Jake freeze. A scraping sound, like claws dragging across metal. He grabbed Thera's arm and pulled her behind an old crate. The creature from before passed by, slower now, sniffing the air. It didn't see them. Not yet. Jake held his breath, every muscle tight. Then, just as the creature paused, a drop of blood from Thera's leg hit the ground. The sound was tiny, but enough. The creature turned its head sharply, nostrils flaring. Jake didn't think, he acted. He tossed a broken panel across the hallway, making a loud crash. The creature chased the sound instantly, vanishing around the corner. They waited a few seconds, then moved again. Faster now. Finally, they reached the door to the old reactor room. The door was bent and rusted, but Jake used his tools to force it open. Inside, dim blue light still flickered, casting strange patterns on the walls. At the center stood a glowing power core, covered in dust but still alive. Jake smiled, almost in disbelief. "It's working," he said. "We might actually have a chance." As he stepped closer, Thera suddenly grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "This room. It smells wrong." Jake looked around, confused. That's when he saw the marks on the floor, deep claw scratches, fresh and sharp. The creature hadn't been chasing them. It had been guiding them. A soft clicking came from behind the reactor. Then another, and another. Eyes opened in the dark. More than two. More than four. Jake realized too late. There wasn't just one creature. They were surrounded. Jake didn't move. He couldn't. The eyes in the dark stared straight at him. Cold and shining. They blinked slowly, one by one, like creatures waiting for the right moment to strike. Thera stood beside him, her body tense, her half-grown leg trembling beneath her. Jake whispered, "How many are there?" Thera didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was too many. The room was almost silent, except for the low hum of the power core and the slow, sticky sound of claws moving across the floor. Jake glanced at his toolkit, his heart beating like a drum. He had nothing left that could stop even one of those things, let alone a group of them. Thyra whispered. They like fear, Jake asked. Then what do we do? She said nothing and instead stepped forward slowly. Jake grabbed her arm. What are you doing? Her voice was calm but sharp, distracting them. She took another step toward the shadows, her hands raised. The creatures moved slightly. Curious now, they didn't leap. Not yet. Jake looked around, desperate for something, anything, then. He saw an old wall panel, blinking red. It was a vent system, probably damaged, but still connected to the main power. He rushed toward it, opened the hatch, and found a cluster of wires. Thyra stood like a statue, her violet eyes locked with the closest creature. Jake twisted the wires together, sparks flying into his face. The core's energy surged for a second, lights flashing brighter. The creatures twitched. Uncomfortable in the light, Thyra shouted something in her native tongue. A deep, echoing sound filled the air, not just words, something older. The creatures froze, just for a moment. Jake connected the last wire, and a sudden shock burst through. The panel, the power core, flared with blue light, bathing the room in heat and brightness. The creatures screamed sharp, high-pitched screeches that made Jake's ears ring. They turned and vanished into cracks and shadows, crawling backward like spiders under sunlight. And then silence. Thyra collapsed to her knees, breathing hard. Jake ran to her, grabbed her shoulders. Are you okay? She nodded slowly, sweat dripping from her forehead. Her leg had grown nearly to the ankle now, twitching and glowing. She whispered, They don't like the light. Jake helped her stand, then looked back at the power core. It was glowing, bright and strong. He returned to the console, hooked up his transmitter, and typed fast. The screen blinked once, then again, then showed green. Signal sent, he said, his voice cracking. Now all they had to do was wait, but waiting meant staying alive. The walls creaked around them, like the tunnels were shifting again. Rocks above groaned and dropped dust from the ceiling. Jake looked at the ceiling nervously. The structure's not going to hold much longer, he said. We have to move before it collapses. Thyra pointed to a broken transport rail just past the reactor room. It leads to the old lift shaft, she said. If the upper rails are intact, it might take us closer to the surface. Jake nodded and helped her to the rail. They walked slowly, the faint hum of the emergency signal echoing behind them. The ground was uneven, and every few steps, small rocks fell from above. But Thyra was stronger now, her new leg finally touching the ground. She tested it with care, then took a step forward on her own. Jake smiled. You're walking. Not well, she said, but enough. The path narrowed again, darker, tighter. The air was colder here, but less dusty. They walked in silence, the only sound their footsteps on the old metal. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the ground. The wall beside them cracked open. Jake grabbed Thyra and pulled her back just as a section of the rail snapped and fell into the dark below. They stared at the gap, wide and deep. Jake turned to Thyra. I can jump this. She looked at the distance and nodded. I can't, not yet. He looked around and spotted an old mining cable hanging nearby. It was frayed but might hold one person. Jake tied it around his waist, then secured it to the metal beam behind her. I'm going to swing across and find something to pull you over, he said. She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already backing up for the jump. Jake ran and leaped across the gap, the cable holding just enough. He landed hard, rolled, and coughed from the pain. He stood and looked back at her. Still alive, he smiled. Thyra managed a small laugh, very human. But before Jake could untie the cable, a distant howl rose behind her. Not just one, but many. The creatures had returned, and this time they were coming fast. Jake shouted, "Jump now!" Thyra stepped back, bent her knees and pushed forward. Her half-regrown leg shook under her, but she flew through the air. Jake caught her mid-air, both of them falling backward onto the ground. He held her close, breathing hard, behind them. Claws scratched the metal, growing louder, closer. They got up quickly and ran into the next tunnel, the light from the power core now far behind. The creatures followed, and there was only one way left to go forward into the dark. The tunnel ahead narrowed like a throat, cold air rushing through as if the cave itself was breathing. Jake led the way, his light flickering weakly against the walls covered in strange carvings and moss. Thera followed closely, her steps steadier now, her new leg nearly complete, behind them. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, scratching claws, clicking teeth, and low animal growls. The creatures were no longer hiding. They were hunting openly, without fear. The light and noise had only slowed them, not scared them away. Jake's hands trembled as he checked the small map on his wrist display. Come on, he muttered. Where's that lift control room? A red dot blinked ahead on the map, weak but promising. Thera placed her hand on the wall for balance, her breathing sharp. I feel pressure above, she said. The mountain is shifting again. Jake looked up and nodded. We need to get out before this place becomes our tomb. As they turned the corner, a strange blue glow lit the space before them. It wasn't the cold glow of power lines or computer lights. This was warmer, flickering, alive. They stepped into a round chamber carved by hand or claw. In the center floated a glowing crystal, cracked and pulsing like a weak heart. It hovered above a circular base, surrounded by old alien machines, wires tangled like vines. Jake approached it carefully, scanning the base with his tool. It's a power node, he said, surprised. Still active. Thera walked around. Eyes narrowing. It's from the old empire, she whispered. Very rare, very dangerous. Jake's mouth twitched. Dangerous how? If overcharged, it explodes, she said calmly. Jake blinked. Of course it does. He crouched near the control terminal and plugged in his toolkit. A low hum filled the chamber as data scrolled across the screen in an old alien language. Thera leaned close, her fingers dancing across the symbols. There's enough charge left to power the lift and send a full rescue signal, she said. Jake grinned. Then we're getting out of here. But the sound of metal grinding against stone interrupted his smile. The creatures had arrived. Their thin bodies crawled through the cracks and vents, dozens of them. Their eyes glowed dimly like dying stars. Jake stood in front of the crystal, blocking it with his body. No more hiding, he said. We stand here. Thera didn't argue. She pulled a small blade from her belt, curved and etched with markings from her people. Jake raised his wrench again, hands sweaty, heart pounding. The creatures circled slowly, not rushing this time, as if testing their prey. Then one lunged. Jake struck it in midair, knocking it aside. Thera sliced through another, her movements sharp and fast, but for each one they stopped. Two more came. Jake backed up. Protecting the console, the power node behind him began glowing brighter, too bright. Thera turned and saw it pulsing rapidly. It's overloading, she said. If it breaks, the whole cave will collapse. Jake looked at her, breathing hard. Can we stop it? She hesitated, then said, only by draining it into something living. Jake frowned. Living like what? Like me, she answered, without emotion. Jake shouted, no, absolutely not. But she stepped toward the core anyway, placing both hands on its cracked surface. Her body jerked from the energy surge, her eyes glowing. The creatures screamed and retreated, afraid of the light pouring from her. Jake ran to her, trying to pull her away, but she shouted, I can hold it. Just activate the lift. He turned to the console and smashed the final command key. A deep rumble shook the cave, and a hidden door slid open in the far wall. A platform rose slowly, covered in dust and vines, ancient but still working. Jake looked back at Thera, her face strained, her body shaking with power. She whispered, go. He shook his head. Not without you. She gave a faint smile. You humans never follow orders. Jake ran back to her and grabbed her arm. You're not doing this alone, he said. Then, without asking, he pulled one of the energy cables from the machine and plugged it into his own wrist console. A jolt ran through him, nearly dropping him to the floor. The pain was like fire in his veins, but he stayed standing. The node dimmed slightly as it fed into both of them now. The creatures wailed and ran, shadows fleeing the fire. Jake and Thera collapsed onto the lift, the power fading from the room. As the platform began to rise, the cave below them trembled, walls cracked, dust rained down. And the last thing they saw was the glowing node shatter in silence. The tunnel below disappeared in fire, but the lift rose higher, carrying them toward the surface. Neither of them spoke. They were too tired, too broken, too alive. The lift rose through darkness, its engine humming softly like a whisper inside a tomb. Jake leaned against the side rail, blood dripping from his hand where the power surge had burned him. Thera sat beside him, her eyes dim but still awake. Her skin flickered with leftover energy, glowing faintly as her body fought to stay together. The power node had almost torn her apart from the inside, but somehow she had survived. Jake looked at her, unsure if she was still conscious then. Her voice came, dry and cracked. "You should have left me." He shook his head. "Never." Above them, the tunnel began to widen, and a cold breeze rushed in from somewhere distant. The surface had to be close. Jake's wrist display blinked with a weak signal. "Rescue ping received," it read. "Hold position." He laughed under his breath. "They're finally listening." But Thera didn't laugh. She looked straight ahead, her eyes fixed on a shape slowly forming above. It wasn't light, and it wasn't open sky. It was a door, massive, ancient, and closed tight with strange carvings running across it. Jake stood up weakly and stared. "That's not in any human map," he said. Thera nodded slowly. "It's not human." The lift stopped with a sudden jolt. In front of them stood a gateway, covered in dust and time. It pulsed softly, responding to Thera's presence. She stepped forward, her hands brushing the carvings like remembering a dream. Jake asked, "What is this place?" She closed her eyes and whispered, "This is where my bloodline began." The door opened slowly, without a sound. Beyond it lay a chamber so vast it felt like the heart of the planet. Glowing orbs floated in the air, casting light across ancient stone and gold. In the center stood a machine, tall, alive, and waiting. Jake stepped back instinctively. The machine turned toward them, no face, only shifting metal. Thera stepped forward, weak but steady. The machine spoke, but not in words. Its voice was a vibration that made the bones shake. Jake felt it inside his chest. Thera responded in her language, soft and strong. The machine paused, then extended an arm toward her. Jake shouted, "Wait, what is it doing?" Thera looked back at him. "It's testing my right to lead." Before Jake could stop her, she placed her palm against the machine's core. A shockwave burst through the chamber, blowing dust into the air. The floating orbs flared bright and then went dark. The machine sank into the floor, leaving behind only silence. Jake ran to her, catching her before she fell. "What was that?" he asked. She whispered, "It accepted me. I am heir to the old code." Her body shimmered, the last of the regeneration completing itself, but her face was filled with pain. Not victory. Jake didn't understand, but he knew the cost had been high. The ground trembled again, and the walls began to crack. The mountain was falling apart around them. A door opened behind the chamber, revealing a spiral ramp leading upward. Jake grabbed Thera's hand, pulling her up with him. They climbed fast, even though their legs felt like stone. Every step was a scream of muscle and breath, but they kept going, because now it wasn't just about escaping. It was about carrying the truth that had been buried. For generations at the top, a metal hatch opened with the smell of real air. Jake stumbled out into the light, clouds swirling above a snowy ridge. He turned back and pulled Thera beside him. The wind touched their faces like a promise. A rescue ship hovered above, lights flashing, doors wide open. Soldiers rushed forward, shouting orders and scanning them, but Jake didn't hear any of it. He just looked at Thera, who stood tall now. The mountain behind them cracked and collapsed, taking the secrets with it. One soldier said, "What happened down there?" Jake looked at him, eyes empty and tired. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Snow fell slowly across the high ridge, quiet and soft. The rescue ship hovered beside the broken mountain, its lights blinking against the clouds. Jake sat on a folding bench near the ship's open bay, his coat wrapped tightly around him. A hot drink steamed in his hands, but he wasn't drinking. His eyes were fixed on the woman standing at the edge of the cliff. Thura stood with her back straight, her long silver hair blowing in the cold wind. She wasn't shivering. She didn't look tired anymore. She looked like something ancient that had finally remembered who it was. Below them, the mountain groaned. One last time, then collapsed inward, swallowing the ancient chamber. The power core, the old codes, and the crawling horrors in one deep breath of stone. Dust rose high into the sky, mixing with the clouds like smoke from a fire finally ending. Jake stood and walked to her side. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. For a long moment, they just stood there. Two survivors staring down at a secret no one else would ever understand. When she finally turned, her eyes were brighter than before. But there was something heavy behind them. Jake asked, "So, what now?" Thyra looked at the ship, then at the sky. The beacon reached more than just the rescue team. She said, "My people will come now." Jake frowned. "Is that a good thing?" She smiled faintly. "For some, yes. For others, it means change." Inside the ship, the crew prepared to leave. Medical drones floated nearby, offering scans and care. Jake waved them off. He wasn't hurt in ways a machine could fix. Thura walked past the crew without answering any of their questions. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, her fingers brushing the controls like they were familiar. Jake sat beside her and leaned back. The pilot looked over, surprised. "Are you cleared?" "For flight?" Thura answered without turning her head. "I'm more than cleared." As the ship rose into the sky, Jake watched the world below shrink. The forest, the ice, the shattered entrance to the mountain all disappeared into white fog. He said softly, "I can't believe we made it." Thyra nodded. "You believed enough to stay." He smiled a little. "You told me your leg would grow back, but I didn't expect all of this." She looked down at her foot, now fully formed and covered in new armor. "I didn't expect you," she said. "Not really." They flew in silence for a while. The stars came out one by one above the clouds. Jake finally asked the question that had been sitting on his chest. "You knew what that machine was, didn't you?" Thura nodded. "It was built by my ancestors as a gatekeeper," she said. "Only blood of their line could pass." "And you passed," Jake said. She looked out the window. "I passed the test. But I'm no longer sure I want the throne it offers." He studied her face. "You don't have to take it," he said. She looked at him, and something changed in her expression. "Maybe I don't," she said, "but maybe I need to for the others who never had a choice." The ship reached orbit, and stars filled every corner of the glass. A call came through from a high-priority channel. Thyra answered, speaking in her native language. Voice calm and cold. Jake didn't understand the words, but he understood the weight behind them when she ended the call. She looked at him. "They want me to return," she said. Jake leaned forward. "Will you go?" She smiled, not the warrior's smile he had seen before, but something softer. "Only if you're coming with me." He laughed, then shook his head. "You sure that's allowed?" "No," she said, "but you helped me grow back more than a leg. You reminded me how to feel." Jake didn't say anything for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a cracked piece of the glowing power node. It pulsed gently, like a memory refusing to fade. He placed it in her hand. "Proof we were there," he said. She closed her fingers around it. Proof that even when trapped, even when broken, even when afraid, you can still choose to fight, still choose to save someone else. The stars spun slowly around the ship as it changed direction, not back toward Earth, not yet, but toward a future that neither of them fully understood. And for the first time in many days, neither of them felt alone.